The sun was dipping low over the Everglades, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, when 17-year-old Jamal Carter stepped onto the crowded bus in downtown Miami. It was a sticky summer afternoon, the kind where the air feels like a wet blanket, and the bus was packed with folks heading home from work or school. Jamal, a lanky kid with a backpack slung over one shoulder, was just trying to get to his part-time job at the local grocery store. He wasn't looking for anything special that day, just hoping to make it through his shift and maybe grab a soda on his way home. But life, as it often does, had other plans. As he squeezed through the aisle, his eyes caught a woman standing near the back, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other gripping the pole for balance. She looked tired, her face flushed from the heat, and Jamal didn't think twice. He tapped her gently on the shoulder and offered her a seat. It was a small gesture, the kind of thing most people would do, without expecting anything in return. But what happened next? Well, that's where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. The woman, pale and maybe in her late 20s, gave Jamal a small, grateful smile as she eased herself into the seat. She didn't say much at first, just a quiet thank you, as she adjusted her bag on her lap. Jamal nodded, standing nearby, his earbuds dangling as he scrolled through his phone to pass the time. The bus rumbled along, weaving through the city, the hum of conversations and the occasional honk from outside filling the air. Most people would have left it at that, a simple exchange, a moment of kindness, and then back to their own lives. But this woman, she was different. There was something about her, something in the way her eyes lingered on Jamal, like she was seeing more than just a kid who gave up his seat. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small notebook, and started scribbling something. Jamal didn't notice at first, too caught up in his music, but when she tore out the page and handed it to him, his world tilted just a little. The note was folded neatly, and when Jamal opened it, his eyes scanned the words quickly. At first, he thought it was a mistake. Maybe she meant to give it to someone else. The words on the paper didn't make sense, not in the way he expected. It wasn't a thank you note, not exactly. It was something else entirely, something that made his heart race and his palms sweat. He looked up at the woman, but she was already staring out the window, her expression unreadable. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer right away, just turned to him with a look that felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. "Read it again," she said softly. "And don't tell anyone. Not yet." Before Jamal could ask anything else, the bus lurched to a stop, and she was gone, disappearing into the crowd like she'd never been there at all. Now let's pause for a second. Imagine being Jamal, just a regular teenager from a working-class family, trying to juggle school, a job, and dreams of maybe one day getting out of the neighborhood. He's not perfect, nobody is, but he's got a good heart, the kind that makes him offer his seat without expecting a pat on the back. And now he's holding this note, this strange, cryptic piece of paper that feels like it could change everything. What did it say? Why did she give it to him? Was it a promise, a warning, or something else entirely? Jamal stuffed the note into his pocket, his mind racing as the bus pulled away. He didn't know it yet, but that single piece of paper was about to pull him into a story bigger than he could have ever imagined, one that would take him from the crowded streets of Miami to the murky, mysterious depths of the Everglades. A year later, miles away from that bus ride, a fisherman named Carl was out in the Everglades, hauling up his crab traps under the early morning mist. The Everglades are a wild place, all tangled mangroves and hidden waterways, where alligators lurk and secrets seem to sink into the muck. Carl had been fishing these waters for years, pulling up traps filled with blue crabs, the kind that end up on dinner plates across Florida. But that morning, something was different. One of his traps felt heavier than usual, like it was caught on something big. He tugged and cursed, thinking maybe it was snagged on a root or some old junk. When he finally got it to the surface, though, what he saw wasn't crabs. It was something that made his blood run cold, something that would bring Jamal's name back into the light and tie that bus ride to a mystery nobody saw coming. What was in that trap? And what did it have to do with Jamal and the note that woman handed him? The Everglades don't give up their secrets easily, and neither does the story. Stick around, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about a simple act of kindness. Jamal stood on the bus, his fingers brushing against the folded note in his pocket, the paper already starting to feel worn from how many times he'd taken it out to read. The words didn't make any more sense now than they had the first time he'd seen them. Meet me at the edge of the glades. Midnight. 1 week from today. Bring no one. There was an address too, scrawled in hurried ink, pointing to a spot deep in the Everglades, a place Jamal had only ever heard about in stories. The kind of stories where people went in and didn't come out. He didn't know why the woman had picked him, a random kid who'd just given up his seat. He didn't even know her name. But something about the way she'd looked at him, like she was handing him a puzzle he was meant to solve, stuck with him. As the bus rolled on, he kept stealing glances at the empty seat where she'd been, half expecting her to reappear. She didn't. By the time he got to stop, the sun had set and the Miami streets were buzzing with evening life, music spilling out of corner stores, kids laughing as they zipped by on bikes. But Jamal's mind was somewhere else, already tangled in the mystery of that note. Back home, in the small apartment he shared with his mom and younger sister, Jamal tried to act normal. His mom, Denise, was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of rice and beans, the smell filling the cramped space. She was a nurse, always working long shifts, and tonight she looked more tired than usual, her braids pulled back in a messy bun. "You okay, baby?" she asked, glancing over as Jamal dropped his backpack by the door. He nodded, forcing a smile, but his thoughts were racing. He wanted to tell her about the note, about the woman, but something stopped him. The woman's words, "Don't tell anyone," echoed in his head. Instead, he grabbed a plate, sat at the table, and listened as his sister, Kyla, rambled about her science project. She was 12, all energy and big ideas, and she didn't notice the way Jamal kept his hand in his pocket, guarding the note like it might disappear. That night, lying in bed, he read it again under the glow of his phone. The address was real, he'd looked it up. A dirt road off Alligator Alley, leading to a spot where the Everglades swallowed everything. Why there? And why him? Sleep didn't come easy. The next few days were a blur. Jamal went to school, worked his shifts at the grocery store, and tried to keep his head down. But the note was like a splinter, impossible to ignore. He started noticing things, little details that felt off. Like the way a man in a dark jacket seemed to linger outside the store one evening, watching him through the glass. Or how his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number, but when he answered, there was only silence. Maybe he was being paranoid, but the note had changed the way he saw the world. It wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was a key to something bigger, something he didn't understand yet. By the time the week was up, Jamal had made up his mind. He wasn't sure if it was curiosity or something deeper, but he was going to that address. He had to know. The night of the meeting, Jamal told his mom he was staying late at a friend's house to study. It was a lie, and it sat heavy in his chest as he hugged her goodbye. He borrowed Kyla's bike, threw on a hoodie, and pedaled out toward the edge of the city. The air grew cooler as he left the neon lights behind, the road stretching into darkness. Alligator Alley was a lonely stretch, flanked by endless sawgrass and the occasional glow of eyes in the water, gators probably, or something else watching from the shadows. Jamal's heart pounded as he reached the dirt road from the note. It was barely a path, more like a suggestion, winding into the mangroves. He hid the bike behind a tree and checked his phone. 11:45 p.m. The Everglades were alive around him, buzzing with insects, the distant croak of frogs, and the rustle of something moving in the dark. He clutched the note, his only anchor, and waited. Midnight came and went. Nobody showed. The air was thick, the kind of humid that made your clothes stick to your skin, and Jamal's nerves were fraying. He was about to leave, chalking it up to a prank or a mistake, when he heard it, a low hum, like an engine, coming from deeper in the glades. Headlights flickered through the trees, and for a moment, he thought it was her, the woman from the bus. But the vehicle that pulled up wasn't what he expected. It was a beat-up pickup truck, the kind Fisherman used, with mud caked on the tires. A man stepped out, his face hidden under a baseball cap. He didn't seem to notice Jamal at first, just started unloading gear, ropes, a flashlight, a bag that clinked like it was full of metal. Jamal's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. Then the man turned, his eyes locking onto Jamal's, and said, "You're early, kid." His voice was rough, like gravel, and it sent a chill down Jamal's spine. The man didn't explain who he was or why he was there. Instead, he gestured for Jamal to follow, pointing toward a narrow path that disappeared into the swamp. "She said you'd come," he muttered, and Jamal's stomach dropped.
She.
The woman from the bus. Was she here? Was this a setup? Every horror movie he'd ever watched flashed through his mind, but something, maybe the same thing that made him give up his seat that day, pushed him forward. The man led him through the mangroves, the ground squelching under their feet, until they reached a small clearing by a canal. The water was black, reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. In the center of the clearing was a wooden dock, and tied to it was a flat-bottomed boat, the kind used for navigating the shallow waters. The man climbed in, motioning for Jamal to join him. "You want answers?" he said, not looking back. "Get in." Jamal hesitated. He wasn't stupid. He knew this could go wrong in 100 ways. But the note, the woman, the mystery, it was all pulling him in, like a current he couldn't fight. He stepped into the boat, gripping the sides as it rocked under his weight. The man started the engine, and they glided into the canal, the Everglades closing around them like a living thing. The air was heavy with the smell of mud and decay, and Jamal's eyes darted to every shadow, half expecting something to lunge out of the water. The man didn't talk much, just steered the boat deeper into the swamp, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "She's been out here," he said after a while, his voice low. "Not the only one either." Jamal's throat tightened. "Who?" he asked, but the man just shook his head. "You'll see." They stopped at a spot where the canal widened, the mangroves thinning out to reveal a stretch of open water. The man cut the engine, and the silence was deafening. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small device, something that looked like a GPS tracker, its screen glowing faintly. "This is where it happened," he said, his eyes scanning the water. Jamal didn't know what it was, but the way the man said it made his skin crawl. He wanted to ask more, but the man held up a hand, silencing him. Then, from somewhere in the distance, came a sound, a low, mournful cry, like an animal, but not quite. It echoed across the water, and Jamal's heart was in his throat. The man cursed under his breath, his hand tightening on the flashlight. "We're not alone out here," he whispered. Meanwhile, a year later, Carl the fisherman was out on his boat, the same one he'd used for decades, checking his crab traps like he always did. The Everglades were his home, a place where he knew every bend in the river, every spot where the crabs liked to hide. But that morning, something felt off. The air was too still, the water too quiet. He'd been hearing rumors for months, stories about people going missing in the glades, whispers about strange lights in the sky, boats found abandoned with no sign of their owners. Carl didn't put much stock in rumors, but he couldn't shake the unease in his gut. When he pulled up that one trap, the heavy one, he expected maybe a log or an old tire. Instead, what came up was something else entirely, something that made him drop the rope and stumble back. It wasn't just the sight of it, it was what it meant, what it connected to. Back in the boat with Jamal, the man was still staring at the water, his face unreadable. Jamal's mind was racing, trying to piece it all together. The woman, the note, this man, the Everglades, it was all part of something bigger, something dangerous. He thought about his mom, about Kyla, about the life he'd left behind just to chase this mystery. "What's out here?" he finally asked, his voice shaking. The man turned to him, his eyes hard. "Answers," he said. "But you might not like what you find." Before Jamal could respond, the cry came again, closer this time, and the man's hand went to something under his jacket, something that glinted in the moonlight. The boat rocked gently, the water lapping against the sides, and Jamal realized he was in way over his head. Whatever was out here, whatever the woman had pulled him into, it wasn't just a note anymore. It was a secret, buried deep in the Everglades, and it was about to surface. The boat rocked gently in the dark waters of the Everglades, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something sharper, almost metallic. Jamal's hands gripped the edges of the boat, his knuckles pale under the moonlight. The man, whose name he still didn't know, stood at the helm, his eyes scanning the shadows like he was expecting something to leap out at any moment. That cry they'd heard, low and eerie, had faded, but it left a weight in the air, like the swamp itself was holding its breath. Jamal's mind was spinning. The note, the woman on the bus, this stranger who seemed to know more than he was letting on, it was all starting to feel like a trap. But what kind?
And why him?
He glanced at the man's hand, still resting on whatever was under his jacket. A gun? A knife? Jamal's stomach twisted, but he didn't dare ask. Instead, he whispered, "What's out here? You keep talking about her, but who is she?" The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Jamal thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above the hum of the insects, he said, "She's someone who got too close to something she shouldn't have. And now you're here, kid, because of her." Back in Miami, Jamal's mom, Denise, was starting to worry. It wasn't like him to stay out so late without texting. She stood in their small kitchen, her phone in one hand, the other rubbing her temple. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, and Kyla was already asleep, her science books spread out on the couch. Denise had called Jamal's friend Marcus, the one he said he was studying with, but Marcus hadn't seen him all day. Something wasn't right. She thought about the past week, how Jamal had been quieter than usual, always checking his phone, slipping out of the room when she asked how his day was. She'd chalked it up to teenage stuff, maybe a girl or stress from school, but now her gut was telling her it was more. She grabbed her keys, ready to drive to the grocery store where he worked, when she noticed his backpack by the door. It was unzipped, and inside was a folded piece of paper she didn't recognize. Her hands shook as she opened it, reading the words that sent a chill through her. "Meet me at the edge of the glades. Midnight." Denise didn't know what it meant, but she knew her son was in trouble. Out in the Everglades, the man steered the boat deeper into the maze of canals, the flashlight beam cutting through the mist. Jamal's eyes darted to the water, where shadows seemed to move just beneath the surface. He was trying to piece it together. The woman, the note, this guy who acted like he'd been expecting him. "You said she got too close," Jamal said, his voice steadier than he felt. Too close to what? The man didn't look at him, just kept his eyes on the water. "Something people don't talk about out here," he said finally. "Something they don't want found." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small, weathered journal, its pages yellowed and curling. "She left this behind," he said, tossing it to Jamal. "Read it. But don't say I didn't warn you." Jamal caught the journal, his fingers brushing against the rough leather cover. He opened it, the handwriting inside matching the note in his pocket. It was hers, the woman from the bus. The pages were filled with notes about the Everglades, sketches of plants, coordinates, and strange symbols he didn't understand. One word kept popping up: project. Meanwhile, Carl the fisherman was still shaken from what he'd pulled up in his crab trap that morning. He hadn't told anyone yet, not even his wife. He dragged the trap back to his boat and covered it with a tarp, his hands trembling as he drove back to shore. It wasn't just the object itself, though that was bad enough. It was what it meant. Carl had lived in these parts his whole life, knew the stories about the glades. People went missing out here all the time. Hikers, bloggers, even locals who knew better. Most folks blamed gators or quicksand, but Carl had heard other whispers, tales of secret experiments, government cover-ups, things buried in the swamp that weren't supposed to see daylight. He'd always laughed them off, but now he wasn't so sure. The thing in his trap wasn't natural, wasn't something that belonged in the Everglades. It was man-made, and it had a name scratched into it, a name that made his heart skip: Jamal Carter. Back in the boat, Jamal was flipping through the journal, his eyes catching on a page that mentioned a site deep in the glades. The woman had written about it like it was a secret she was desperate to uncover, something tied to missing people and strange activity in the swamp. There were dates, too, some from over a year ago, and one that stood out: the day she'd handed him the note. Jamal's throat went dry. Had she known something was going to happen to her? Was that why she'd picked him? The man noticed his expression and snorted. "You're starting to get it, aren't you?" he said. "She wasn't just some lady on a bus. She was looking for you." Jamal's head snapped up. "Me? Why?" The man shrugged, but his eyes were sharp. "Maybe she saw something in you. Or maybe you were just in the right place at the wrong time." The boat slowed as they approached a cluster of mangroves, their roots twisting into the water like gnarled fingers. The man tied the boat to a low branch and stepped onto a patch of solid ground, motioning for Jamal to follow. The ground was soft, sucking at Jamal's sneakers, and the air felt heavier here, like it was pressing down on him. The man pointed to a spot in the distance, where the trees opened up to reveal a faint glow, unnatural against the dark. "That's where we're going," he said. "But you need to decide now, kid. You can turn back, pretend you never got that note. Or you can keep going, and maybe you'll find out what happened to her." Jamal's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He thought about his mom, about Kyla, about the life he had back home. But he also thought about the woman's face, the way she'd looked at him like he was part of something bigger. He clutched the journal tighter and nodded. "I'm going." Back in Miami, Denise was driving toward Alligator Alley, her hands gripping the wheel so tight her knuckles ached. She'd called the police, but they hadn't been much help. Just told her to file a missing persons report if Jamal didn't show up by morning. She wasn't waiting that long. The note was tucked into her purse, and she kept replaying the words in her head. The Everglades weren't a place you went to at midnight for no reason. She thought about the news stories she'd seen over the years. People vanishing in the swamp, their boats found empty, their families left with nothing but questions. She'd always told Jamal to stay away from the Glades, that it was no place for a kid. But now her son was out there, and she'd do whatever it took to find him. In the Everglades, Jamal and the man moved through the trees, the glow growing brighter as they got closer. The journal was heavy in Jamal's hands, its pages full of clues he didn't fully understand. There were mentions of a facility, of experiments gone wrong, of people who'd stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. The woman, her name, he'd learned from the journal, was Elena, had been a blogger, someone who wrote about environmental issues, digging into stories the government didn't want told. She'd been tracking something in the Everglades, something big, and it had led her here. But what? And why had she dragged Jamal into it? The man stopped suddenly, his hand raised, and Jamal froze. There was a sound, footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from the direction of the glow. The man's hand went to his jacket again, and this time, Jamal saw it clearly, a gun. "Stay behind me," the man whispered, his voice low and urgent. At the same time, Carl was back at his house, staring at the thing he'd pulled from the trap. He'd locked it in his shed, away from prying eyes, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. The name, Jamal Carter, kept echoing in his mind. He didn't know any Jamals, didn't know why that name would be out there in the swamp, attached to something so strange. He thought about calling the police, but something stopped him. The Everglades had a way of keeping secrets, and he'd learned long ago that some things were better left alone. But this felt different. He grabbed his phone and started searching, typing Jamal Carter into every database he could think of. What he found, or didn't find, only made the knot in his stomach tighter. Jamal's breath caught as the footsteps grew louder, crunching through the underbrush. The glow was close now, pulsing faintly, like it was alive. The man's gun was out, held low but ready, and Jamal's heart was racing. He wanted to run, to get back to the boat, to forget he'd ever seen that note. But Elena's words in the journal burned in his mind. They can't hide it forever. Someone has to know. Whoever they were out here, and Jamal was starting to think he'd walked right into their trap. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then a voice called out, sharp and cold, from the darkness. "You shouldn't be here." The man spun around, raising his gun, and Jamal's world tilted as the glow flared brighter, revealing something, or someone, standing just beyond the trees. The voice from the darkness cut through the humid air like a blade, and Jamal's heart stopped for a split second. "You shouldn't be here." The words hung heavy, laced with a warning that made the hair on his neck stand up. The man, still nameless to Jamal, tightened his grip on the gun, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the trees. The glow they'd been following pulsed brighter, casting long shadows that twisted like fingers across the mangroves. Jamal clutched Elena's journal, its leather cover slick with his sweat, and took a step back, his sneakers sinking into the muddy ground. The Everglades felt alive around them, the chirps of insects and distant splashes amplifying the silence that followed the stranger's voice. The man gestured for Jamal to stay low, his face hard but his eyes flickering with something like fear. "Don't move," he whispered, barely loud enough for Jamal to hear. But Jamal's mind was racing. Who was out there? Was it Elena? Someone else? And what was that glow, humming like it had a heartbeat of its own? In Miami, Denise was speeding down Alligator Alley, her old sedan rattling as she pushed it faster than she should. The note she'd found in Jamal's backpack was crumpled in her hand, the address burned into her memory. Her phone sat in the passenger seat, the screen dark after the police had brushed her off again. "He's probably just out with friends," the officer had said, like Jamal was the kind of kid to disappear without a word. Denise knew better. Her son was responsible, always checking in, always looking out for her and Kyla. The thought of him out here, in the Everglades of all places, made her chest tight. She'd heard the stories everyone in Florida had. Missing hikers, abandoned boats, whispers of things hidden in the swamp that nobody talked about in the daylight. As the road stretched into the darkness, she spotted a dirt path branching off to the side, half hidden by sawgrass. It matched the address. She pulled over, her hands shaking as she grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. "Hold on, baby," she whispered, stepping out into the night. "I'm coming." Back in the swamp, the man edged forward, his gun trained on the shadows where the voice had come from. Jamal's pulse pounded in his ears, every rustle in the bushes making him flinch. The glow was closer now, maybe 50 feet away, coming from a clearing just beyond a tangle of mangroves. It wasn't natural, not like a campfire or a lantern. It was too steady, too blue, like something out of a sci-fi movie. The journal in his hands felt heavier with every step, Elena's words looping in his mind. They can't hide it forever. Whoever they were close, and Jamal was starting to think he'd walked into something way bigger than he could handle. The man stopped suddenly, his head tilting as if he'd heard something. Then it came again, a low hum, different from the engine of their boat, deeper, like it was coming from underground. The ground beneath Jamal's feet vibrated faintly, and he froze. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The man didn't answer, just pointed toward the clearing. "We're about to find out." At the same time, Carl was pacing in his shed, the thing from the crab trap sitting under a tarp in the corner. He hadn't touched it since he dragged it home, but he couldn't stop staring at it. The name, Jamal Carter, was etched into the metal, rough but clear, like someone had carved it in a hurry. It wasn't just the name that bothered him. The object itself was wrong, all sharp angles and strange markings, nothing like the fishing gear or junk he usually pulled from the water. He tried searching for Jamal Carter online, but nothing came up, no social media, no news articles, nothing. It was like the kid didn't exist. But Carl had lived in the Everglades long enough to know that some things didn't make it to the internet. He thought about the rumors again, secret projects, government cover-ups, people vanishing without a trace. His wife, Marla, had told him to call the cops, but Carl wasn't so sure. Whatever this was, it felt like something you didn't just hand over. He grabbed his keys, deciding to head back to the dock. Maybe there was more out there, something that would explain what he'd found. In the clearing, the glow was almost blinding now, spilling out from a structure half hidden by the trees. It wasn't a building, not exactly, more like a dome, low and sleek, with no windows and a surface that looked like it absorbed the light rather than reflected it. Jamal's breath caught as he crouched behind the man, who was peering through the mangroves. The hum was louder here, a steady drone that made his teeth ache. There were figures moving near the dome, their silhouettes blurry in the glow. They weren't wearing uniforms, but they moved with purpose, like they knew exactly what they were doing. One of them carried a case, another held what looked like a tablet, its screen flashing with data. Jamal's eyes darted to the journal, where Elena had sketched something that looked eerily like this dome, with a note scrawled beside it. "They're watching. Always watching." His stomach churned. Was this what she'd been after? Was this why she'd disappeared? The man nudged Jamal, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay here. Don't make a sound." Before Jamal could protest, the man crept forward, his gun still drawn, blending into the shadows like he'd done this 100 times. Jamal's heart was racing so fast he thought it might burst. He wanted to run, to get back to the boat, to forget he'd ever met that woman on the bus. But the journal in his hands, Elena's words, her desperate handwriting, it all kept him rooted to the spot. He flipped to another page, his eyes scanning a passage about samples and tests in the Everglades, things Elena had been trying to expose before she vanished. One line stood out. "If they find you, they'll make you disappear too." Jamal's hands shook as he closed the journal, his eyes darting to the dome. The figures were closer now, their voices low but sharp, like they were arguing. He caught a few words: containment, breach, the kid, and his blood ran cold. Were they talking about him? Miles away, Denise was pushing through the swamp, her flashlight beam shaking as it cut through the darkness. The dirt path had led her to a canal, where she'd found Kyla's bike hidden behind a tree. Her heart sank. Jamal had been here, and he wasn't alone. She'd seen the tire tracks of a truck nearby, deep and fresh in the mud. She didn't know much about the Everglades, but she knew enough to be scared. The stories weren't just rumors out here. They were warnings. She called Jamal's name, her voice echoing over the water, but there was no answer, only the croak of frogs and the rustle of leaves. Her flashlight caught something glinting in the mud, a phone, its screen cracked but still glowing faintly. She picked it up, her breath catching as she recognized Jamal's case, the one Kyla had decorated with stickers. The screen was locked, but a notification flashed, a missed call from an unknown number, time-stamped an hour ago. Denise's hands trembled as she pocketed the phone, her eyes scanning the canal. She wasn't leaving without her son. Back at the dome, the man was almost out of sight, creeping closer to the figures. Jamal's chest was tight, every muscle screaming at him to move, to do something, but he didn't know what. The hum from the dome was louder now, almost painful, and the air felt charged, like a storm was about to break. One of the figures turned, their face catching the glow for a split second, and Jamal's heart stopped. It wasn't Elena. It was a man, his features sharp and cold, his eyes scanning the trees like he knew someone was watching. Jamal ducked lower, his breath shallow, praying the mangroves hit him. The journal was still in his hands, and he opened it again, desperate for anything that might make sense of this. A loose page slipped out, fluttering to the ground. He grabbed it, his eyes catching a sketch of a device, small and metallic, with the same markings Carl had seen in his crab trap. Below it, Elena had written, "They're not just hiding it. They're testing it." The figures by the dome were moving faster now, their voices rising. One of them shouted something about a signal, and the hum spiked, the glow flaring so bright Jamal had to shield his eyes. The man who'd brought him here was nowhere in sight, and for a moment, Jamal thought he'd been abandoned. Then he heard it, a rustle, too close, coming from behind him. He spun around, his heart in his throat, but it wasn't the man. It was someone else, their face hidden in the shadows, holding something that glinted in the moonlight. "You're the kid from the bus," they said, their voice low and urgent. "You shouldn't have come." Before Jamal could react, the figure lunged, and the world exploded into chaos as the hum from the dome became a roar, the glow swallowing everything in sight. The roar from the dome shook the ground beneath Jamal's feet, a deafening pulse that drowned out everything else. The figure lunged toward him, their silhouette a blur in the blinding glow, and Jamal stumbled backward, his hands clutching Elena's journal like it was a lifeline. The air crackled with energy, the metallic tang stronger now, almost choking. He hit the ground hard, mud soaking through his jeans, and scrambled to his knees, his eyes darting between the figure and the dome. The stranger's face was still hidden, but their voice low, urgent, almost panicked, cut through the chaos. "You've got no idea what you're messing with, kid," they hissed, stepping closer, the glint in their hand revealing a small, sleek device, not a weapon but something stranger, like the sketch in Elena's journal. Before Jamal could react, the figure froze, their heads snapping toward the dome as the roar spiked again, the glow pulsing like a heartbeat. Then, from the trees, another voice shouted, a voice Jamal recognized. It was the man who'd brought him here, the one with the gun. "Get down," he yelled, and a gunshot cracked through the night, echoing over the Everglades. Jamal dropped flat, his face pressed into the muddy ground, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The figure ducked and bolted into the mangroves, vanishing as quickly as they'd appeared. The man from the boat emerged from the shadows, his gun still raised, his face twisted with a mix of anger and fear. "You okay?" he barked, pulling Jamal to his feet. Jamal nodded, though his legs felt like jelly, the journal still clutched to his chest. "Who is that?" he gasped, his voice shaking. The man didn't answer, just grabbed his arm and dragged him toward the trees, away from the dome's blinding light. "We're out of time," he muttered, his eyes scanning the darkness. "They know you're here now."
They.
That word again, the same one Elena had written over and over in her journal. Jamal's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The note, the dome, the device, the figure who seemed to know him. But before he could ask anything, the man shoved him behind a thick mangrove root and crouched low, his gun trained on the clearing. Miles away, Denise was wading through the shallow canal, her flashlight beam cutting through the mist. Jamal's phone was in her pocket, its cracked screen a constant reminder that her son was out here, somewhere, in this swamp that seemed to swallow everything. The bike, the tire tracks, the note, it all pointed to something bigger, something that made her skin crawl. She tried calling the unknown number from Jamal's phone, but it just rang and rang, no answer, no voicemail. The water was cold around her ankles, the mud pulling at her shoes, but she kept moving, calling his name softly, afraid to shout too loud. The Everglades were quiet now, too quiet, and every rustle made her jump. Then she saw it, a faint glow in the distance, blue and unnatural, flickering through the trees. Her heart leapt. It wasn't a flashlight or a campfire. It was something else, something that didn't belong out here. She gripped the flashlight tighter and pushed forward, her fear for Jamal outweighing the dread pooling in her gut. Back at the clearing, the dome's hum had settled into a low, steady drone, but the tension was thicker than ever. Jamal crouched behind the mangrove, his breath shallow, the journal open in his lap. The man, whose name Jamal now noticed, was stitched on his jacket as Rico, was muttering to himself, checking his gun like he expected a fight. "You weren't supposed to see this," Rico said, his voice low, almost regretful. "She should have known better than to pull you in." Jamal's head snapped up. "Elena? You knew her?" Rico's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked like he might not answer. Then he nodded.
"Yeah.
"I knew her. She was my sister." The words hit Jamal like a punch. His sister? The woman on the bus, the one who'd handed him the note, was Rico's sister? Before he could process it, Rico grabbed the journal from his hands and flipped to a page with a map, crude but detailed, marked with coordinates and a single word, origin. "This is where it started," Rico said, pointing to a spot not far from the dome. "And it's where she disappeared." Jamal's mind reeled. Elena, a blogger digging into secrets in the Everglades, had been Rico's sister. The note, the journal, the address, it wasn't random. She'd chosen him. But why? "What's origin?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rico's eyes darkened. "Something they've been hiding out here for years. Experiments. Tech nobody's supposed to know about." Elena got too close, started asking questions, posting online. Then she was gone. He handed the journal back, his hands steady but his voice tight. "That note she gave you? It wasn't just a meeting spot. It was a warning." Jamal's fingers traced the words on the page, his heart sinking. A warning? But for what? And who were they? The figures by the dome were moving again, their silhouettes sharper now, and one of them was holding something, a case, small and metallic, just like the device the figure had brandished moments ago. At the same time, Carl was back on his boat, motoring through the canals toward the spot where he'd found the crab trap. The object was still in his shed, locked away, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd missed something out here. The name, Jamal Carter *, kept gnawing at him, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. He'd grown up in these waters, knew every twist and turn, but tonight the Everglades felt different, like they were hiding something even from him. His flashlight swept over the water, catching the glint of eyes. Gators, probably, but he wasn't sure. Then he saw it. A boat, small and flat-bottomed, tied to a mangrove just off the canal. It wasn't one he recognized, and that was rare out here. He killed the engine, letting his boat drift closer, his hand resting on the old knife he kept strapped to his belt. The air was heavy, the same metallic smell he'd noticed that morning, and in the distance, he saw a faint blue glow, just like the one Denise was chasing. Back by the dome, the situation was spiraling. Rico pulled Jamal deeper into the mangroves, his gun still raised, as the figures began spreading out, their movements sharp and deliberate, like they were searching for something or someone. Jamal's eyes caught on the case one of them carried, its surface etched with the same symbols he'd seen in Elena's journal. Then came the twist that made his blood run cold. One of the figures turned, and in the glow, Jamal saw her face. It was Elena. Not a memory, not a ghost. Her, alive, her eyes scanning the trees just like the others. But something was wrong. Her movements were stiff, her expression blank, like she wasn't entirely herself. "That's her," Jamal whispered, his voice breaking. Rico's head snapped toward the clearing, his face going pale. "No," he said, his voice barely audible. "That's not possible." But there she was, standing by the dome, holding the case like it was part of her now. The hum from the dome spiked again, and the ground shook, sending Jamal sprawling into the mud. Rico grabbed him, pulling him back, but his eyes were locked on Elena, his gun trembling in his hand. "She's gone," he muttered, more to himself than to Jamal. "They took her. They did something to her." Jamal's mind was racing, the journal's pages flashing in his memory. Asterisk experiments, samples, test star. Was this what Elena had been warning him about? Had they turned her into something else? The figures were closing in now, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, and Jamal realized they were surrounded. The device the figure had held earlier, the one that matched Elena's sketches, was humming too, its sound syncing with the dome's pulse. Jamal's eyes darted to Rico, who was breathing hard, his gun still aimed at the clearing. "We have to move," Rico said, but before they could, a new sound broke through, a woman's voice calling from the canal. "Jamal?" It was Denise. Jamal's heart leapt, but the sound drew the figure's attention, their flashlights swinging toward the water. Rico cursed, grabbing Jamal's arm. "Your mom," he hissed. Jamal nodded, panic flooding his chest. She was here in the middle of this, and the figures were moving toward her voice. Elena, or whatever she was now, turned too, her blank eyes locking onto the canal. The dome's hum grew louder, the glow flaring, and Jamal felt the air shift, like something massive was about to happen. Rico shoved him toward the trees, his voice urgent. "Run, kid.
Now."
But Jamal couldn't move, his eyes fixed on Elena, on the case in her hands, on his mom's voice echoing through the swamp. The figures were closing in, the device was pulsing, and the Everglades seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment everything would break. The Everglades seemed to close in around Jamal as his mom's voice, Denise's voice, echoed through the canal, desperate and sharp. "Jamal," she called again, closer now, her flashlight beams slicing through the mist. The figures by the dome froze, their heads snapping toward the sound, and Elena, or whatever was left of her, tightened her grip on the metallic case, her blank eyes glinting in the blue glow. The dome's hum was a roar now, vibrating through the ground, making Jamal's teeth ache. Rico, crouched beside him, was breathing hard, his gun trembling as he stared at his sister. "That's not her," he whispered, his voice raw, like he was trying to convince himself. But Jamal couldn't take his eyes off Elena, her stiff movements, the way she seemed to be part of the dome's pulse. The figures were moving again, fanning out toward the canal, where Denise's voice rang out, their flashlights cutting through the mangroves. Jamal's heart pounded. He had to get to his mom, had to stop whatever was happening, but Rico grabbed his arm, his grip like iron. "You run out there, you're done," he hissed. "We end this now." Before Jamal could argue, Rico bolted toward the dome, his gun raised, weaving through the trees like a shadow. Jamal hesitated, his mom's voice pulling at him, but the journal in his hands, Elena's journal, felt like it was burning. He flipped it open one last time, his eyes landing on a page he hadn't seen before, a diagram of the dome, with a single line underlined, "Destroy the core." It was a desperate note, scrawled in Elena's handwriting, with coordinates matching the clearing they were in. Jamal's breath caught. This was what she'd been after, why she'd dragged him into this. The dome wasn't just a structure, it was the heart of whatever they were doing out here. He glanced at the clearing, where Rico was now circling the dome, dodging the figure's flashlights. Jamal's legs moved before his brain caught up, sprinting toward the dome, the journal clutched tight, his mom's voice still ringing in his ears. At the canal, Denise was wading deeper, her flashlight shaking as she called for Jamal. The water was up to her knees now, cold and murky, and the glow in the distance was brighter, unnatural, like nothing she'd ever seen. She'd found Jamal's phone, the bike, the tire tracks. Every sign pointed to him being out here, in this swamp that swallowed people whole. Her heart was racing, but she pushed forward, ignoring the fear clawing at her chest. Then she heard it, a gunshot, sharp and loud, followed by shouts and the roar of that strange hum. She froze, her flashlight catching a glimpse of movement on the bank. It was a man, not Jamal, but someone else, his silhouette bulky against the glow. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling but firm. The man turned, and in the light, she saw his face, Carl, the fisherman, his eyes wide with something like panic. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Get out of the water."
Now.
Back at the dome, Jamal reached the clearing just as Rico fired another shot, the bullet pinging off the dome's sleek surface. The figures shouted, scattering, but Elena didn't move. She stood by the dome's entrance, the case in her hands pulsing with the same blue light. Rico was yelling now, his voice breaking. "Elena, it's me. Stop this." But she didn't react, her face blank, her eyes empty. Jamal's stomach twisted. She wasn't herself, not anymore. Whatever they'd done to her, it was tied to that case, that dome, the hum that was shaking the ground. He scanned the journal again, finding a sketch of a case with a note. Deactivated. Break the circuit. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew he had to try. He darted toward Elena, dodging a figure who lunged at him, their flashlight blinding him for a moment. "Jamal?" Rico shouted, but it was too late. Jamal was already at the dome, his hands reaching for the case in Elena's grip. The case was cold, heavier than it looked, and when Jamal touched it, a jolt shot through him, like electricity, but sharper, deeper. Elena's head snapped toward him, her eyes locking onto his, and for a split second, he saw something, fear, maybe, or recognition. "You," she whispered, her voice hollow, like it was coming from somewhere else. Before he could respond, the dome's hum spiked, and the ground shook so hard Jamal stumbled. The figures were closing in, their voices overlapping, shouting about a breach and containment. Rico fired again, keeping them at bay, but Jamal's focus was on the case. He pried it open, his hands shaking, revealing a glowing core inside, wires and circuits pulsing with that same blue light. The journal's words flashed in his mind. Break the circuit. He didn't know how, but he yanked at the wires, tearing them free, sparks flying as the hum faltered, then surged. At the canal, Carl grabbed Denise's arm, pulling her onto the bank just as the glow flared brighter, lighting up the swamp like daylight. "What's happening?" Denise demanded, her voice sharp with fear. Carl's face was pale, his hands trembling as he pointed toward the glow. "I found something out here," he said. "In my trap. It had your boy's name on it." Denise's heart stopped. "Jamal? You know where he is?" Carl nodded, his eyes darting to the glow. "He's out there with them. Whatever they're doing, it's bad. We need to move." Denise didn't hesitate, following Carl as he led her toward the light, her flashlight forgotten, her only thought getting to her son. Back at the dome, the core in the case flickered, the hum stuttering as Jamal pulled another wire. Elena staggered, her hands dropping the case, her eyes clearing for a moment. "Jamal," she said, her voice her own again, weak but real. "You have to stop it. The core, it's not just here." Before she could say more, one of the figures tackled Jamal, pinning him to the ground. The journal fell, pages scattering in the mud, and Rico shouted, firing another shot that missed. The dome's glow was fading now, the hum dying, but the figures were frantic, their voices overlapping in a panic. "It's overloading," one of them yelled, and Jamal felt the ground shake again, harder this time, like something was about to explode. He fought back, kicking free, and grabbed the case, smashing it against the dome's surface. The core shattered, the blue light winking out, and the hum stopped dead. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Elena screamed, a raw, human sound that cut through the night. She collapsed, her body shaking, and Rico ran to her, dropping his gun. "Elena," he cried, cradling her as she gasped for air. The figures were running now, disappearing into the trees, their flashlights fading. Jamal staggered to his feet, his hands burned from the case, his mind reeling. The dome was dark, its surface cracked, but something felt wrong, like the danger wasn't over. He turned to Elena, who was clutching Rico's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "It's not done," she whispered. "There's another one, deeper in the glades." Before Jamal could ask what she meant, he heard his mom's voice again, closer now, calling his name. He spun around, seeing her and Carl emerge from the mangroves, her face pale but fierce. "Jamal," she cried, running to him, pulling him into a hug so tight he couldn't breathe. The reunion was cut short by a new sound, a low, mechanical whine, different from the dome's hum, coming from deeper in the swamp. Jamal's heart sank. Elena's words echoed in his mind. "There's another one." Rico helped Elena to her feet, her face pale but determined. "They've got more out here," she said, her voice weak but clear. "That was just a relay. The real one's bigger. And they know we're onto them now." Denise looked between them, her eyes wide. "Who's they? What's going on?" But before anyone could answer, Carl stepped forward, his face grim. "I found something in the water," he said, his voice low. "Had your name on it, kid. But it wasn't just your name." He pulled a small, crumpled photo from his pocket, one he'd found tucked inside the object from the crab trap. It was a picture of Jamal, taken on the bus that day, smiling as he gave up his seat. And written on the back, in Elena's handwriting, were two words, "He's next." The twist hit Jamal like a wave. The photo, the object, his name, they weren't random. Elena hadn't just chosen him because of a kind gesture. She'd marked him, maybe to save him, maybe to warn him, but it meant he was part of this now, part of whatever was hidden in the Everglades. The whine in the distance grew louder, and Rico's face hardened. "We need to go," he said, helping Elena stand. "They'll come for us." Jamal looked at his mom, at Carl, at the journal pages scattered in the mud, and realized the truth. The note, the dome, Elena's disappearance. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And whatever was out there, deeper in the swamp, was waiting for him. The whine from deep in the Everglades grew louder, a mechanical growl that seemed to vibrate through the mangroves, making Jamal's skin prickle. He stood frozen, his mom's arms still wrapped around him, her breath ragged from fear and relief. The photo Carl had pulled from his pocket, the one of Jamal on the bus, with Elena's scrawled note, "He's next," lay crumpled in the mud beside the scattered pages of her journal. Rico was helping Elena stand, her face pale but her eyes sharper now, like she was fighting to hold on to herself. The dome behind them was dark, its cracked surface no longer glowing, but the air still felt charged, like the swamp was holding its breath. Denise pulled back, her hands gripping Jamal's shoulders, her eyes searching his face. "What is this place?" she demanded, her voice shaking but fierce. "What are you doing out here?" Jamal opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain the note, the woman on the bus, the dome, the experiments? Before he could try, Rico cut in, his voice low and urgent. "We need to move. That sound, it's not done with us." Elena nodded weakly, leaning on her brother. "The relay's down," she said, her voice hoarse, "but the main site, it's still out there." Carl stepped forward, his weathered face tight with worry. "I know these waters," he said, glancing at the canal where his boat was tied. "Whatever's making that noise, it's deeper in the glades, past the old logging trails. Nobody goes there, not even me." Jamal's heart sank. The photo, the journal, Elena's warning, it all pointed to something bigger, something they hadn't stopped by breaking the dome's core. He looked at his mom, her face set with determination despite the fear in her eyes, and knew they couldn't just walk away.
Not now.
Not after everything. Rico picked up Elena's journal from the mud, brushing off the pages, and handed it to Jamal. "She trusted you with this," he said. "You're in it now, kid. We all are." Jamal nodded, the weight of it all settling on his shoulders. He took his mom's hand, and with Carl leading the way, they headed for the boat, the whine in the distance growing louder, like a warning of what was to come. The canal was narrow, the water black and still as Carl's boat glided through the mangroves. Jamal sat beside his mom, her arm around him, while Rico and Elena huddled at the back, whispering in low, urgent tones. The photo was still in Jamal's pocket, its edges crumpled from the chaos. He couldn't stop thinking about it, his face, captured on that bus, chosen for reasons he still didn't fully understand. Elena's journal lay open in his lap, the final pages detailing a main site deeper in the Everglades, a place she'd been tracking before she vanished. Her notes were frantic, filled with words like experiments, containment, and network. One line stood out. "They're using the swamp to hide it, but it's not just tech, it's alive." Jamal's stomach twisted. What did that mean? He glanced at Elena, her face half lit by the moonlight, and saw the strain in her eyes. Whatever they'd done to her at that dome, it had changed her, but she was fighting it. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She met his gaze, her expression fierce despite her weakness. "I will be," she said. "Thanks to you." Denise squeezed Jamal's hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should have told me," she said, her eyes glistening. "Whatever this is, we're in it together now." Jamal nodded, guilt heavy in his chest. He hadn't meant to drag her into this, but seeing her here, wading through the swamp to find him, made him realize how much she'd always been there, even when he thought he had to face things alone. Carl glanced back from the helm, his face grim. "We're getting close," he said, pointing to a bend in the canal where the mangroves thinned out. The whine was deafening now, a pulsing rhythm that seemed to sync with Jamal's heartbeat. The air grew heavier, the metallic smell stronger, and in the distance a new glow appeared. Not blue like the dome, but a sickly green, flickering through the trees like a warning. The boat slowed as they reached a wide lagoon, the water reflecting the green glow like a mirror. At the center was a structure, larger than the dome, half sunk into the swamp like it had grown there. It was sleek, almost organic, its surface pulsing with that green light. Shapes moved around it, more figures, but fewer than at the dome, their movements slow and deliberate. Rico cursed under his breath, his hand tightening on his gun. "That's it," Elena whispered, her voice shaking but determined. "The main site. That's what I was after." She pointed to the journal in Jamal's hands. "The last page, read it." Jamal flipped to the end, his eyes scanning a sketch of the structure, labeled Core Network. Elena's notes described it as the hub of whatever was happening in the Everglades, a project that wasn't just technology but something alive, something that could think, adapt, and control. The final line chilled him. If it activates fully, it won't just be the Glades. It'll be everywhere. Carl docked the boat behind a cluster of mangroves, his hands steady despite the fear in his eyes. I pulled something from the water, he said, his voice low. Had your name on it, kid. I think it came from here. He described the object from the crab trap, metallic, etched with symbols, and heavy with purpose. Jamal's mind flashed to the photo, to Elena's warning, he's next. Was he a target because of the note, or was there something else? Rico leaned forward, his eyes on the structure. They've been testing it out here, he said. Elena found out, started digging. That's why they took her. Elena nodded, her hands trembling as she spoke. It's not just machines. It's connected to people. They used me, tried to make me part of it. Her voice broke, and Rico put a hand on her shoulder, his jaw tight. Jamal looked at his mom, her face pale but resolute. We're shutting it down, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. For you, for her, for all of us. They moved through the mangroves, staying low, the green glow casting eerie shadows. The figures were focused on the structure, their voices muffled but urgent, talking about activation and stabilizing the network. Jamal's heart pounded as he clutched the journal, its pages his only guide. Elena pointed to a panel on the structure's side, half hidden by vines. That's the access point, she whispered. If we can get to it, we can stop it. But getting there meant crossing the open lagoon, where the figures would see them. Rico scanned the area, his gun ready, but his eyes were on Elena, like he was afraid to lose her again. Carl, who'd been quiet, spoke up. I know a way around, he said. There's a shallow path through the water, behind the reeds. I've used it for fishing. Denise nodded, her hand still gripping Jamal's. We do this together, she said, and Jamal felt a surge of courage, knowing she was with him. The path was treacherous, the water cold and pulling at their legs, but Carl led them through the reeds, the structure looming closer with every step. The whine was unbearable now, a high-pitched scream that made Jamal's head throb. Elena was struggling, her strength fading, but she kept moving, her eyes fixed on the panel. When they reached the structure, Rico and Carl kept watch, their silhouettes tense against the green glow. Jamal and Elena approached the panel, its surface covered in symbols that matched the journal. It's a lock, Elena said, her voice weak. The journal has the code. Jamal flipped to the page, finding a sequence of numbers and symbols scrawled in the margin. His hands shook as he punched them in, the panel clicking open to reveal a pulsing core, larger than the one in the dome, its green light almost blinding. Pull the connectors, Elena said, pointing to a series of cables. All of them. Jamal reached in, his hands burning as he yanked the cables free, sparks flying as the whine faltered. The figures noticed, shouting and running toward them, but Rico fired a warning shot, keeping them back. Denise stood by Jamal, her flashlight trained on the core, her face fierce. Keep going, she said, and Jamal pulled harder, the core dimming with each cable. Elena collapsed, her breath ragged, but she grabbed Jamal's arm. You're doing it, she whispered. You're stopping it. The structure shook, the green glow flickering, and the figures stopped, their voices rising in panic. Then, with a final tug, the core went dark, the whine dying into silence. The structure groaned, like it was collapsing in on itself, and the figures fled, disappearing into the swamp. For a moment, no one moved. The Everglades were quiet again, the only sounds the chirping of insects and the lapping of water. Elena slumped against Rico, her eyes closing, but she was smiling. It's over, she said, her voice barely audible. Jamal looked at his mom, her face streaked with mud, but lit with relief. Carl exhaled, his shoulders sagging. Whatever that was, he said, it's done now. But as they turned to leave, Jamal noticed something, a small device, like the one from the dome, lying in the mud where the figures had been. He picked it up, its surface etched with his name, just like Carl's crab trap find. His heart skipped. Was this what Elena had meant by he's next? Had they targeted him from the start? As they made their way back to the boat, the weight of it all settled over Jamal. Elena's journal explained the project, a network of experimental tech, hidden in the Everglades, designed to monitor and control, using people like Elena as conduits. She'd found out, tried to expose it, and they'd taken her, tried to make her part of it. The note she'd given Jamal was her last act of defiance, a way to pass the torch. But why him? He'd never know for sure, but maybe it was his kindness, that moment on the bus, that made her believe he'd fight for the truth. Back in Miami, the police took their statements, but the structure was gone by the time anyone checked, swallowed by the swamp like it had never been there. Elena recovered slowly, with Rico by her side, and Carl went back to fishing, though he never set traps in that lagoon again. Jamal and Denise sat in their kitchen weeks later, the journal on the table between them. Kyla was at school, her science project finished, and the apartment felt normal again, but different. "You scared me," Denise said, her voice soft. Jamal nodded, his fingers tracing the journal's cover. "I didn't mean to," he said, "but I had to know." She smiled, her eyes warm. "You're like me. Can't let things go." They didn't talk about the device with his name, the one he'd kept hidden. He wasn't sure why he didn't tell anyone, but something told him the Everglades still held secrets, and maybe one day, he'd need to go back. For now, though, he was home, with his mom, his sister, and a story that would stay with him forever, a reminder that a single act of kindness could change everything, even in the darkest corners of the swamp.